No democratic government known. Men talk and write much about democracy. I suppose many Americans fondly believe that they live under a democratic form of government. But that is a pet delusion, a tale to be told to children along with other pretty fairy stories. It may be good for 4th of July orators or men seeking election to office. But it is no more than an illusion. It only appears real because men and women vote to elect their favorites. There is not a real democratic government in the world, and there never has been one. There is nothing but oligarchy, and that is mostly an oligarchy of wealth. It is not even an oligarchy of culture. That would be infinitely better. Voters are simply manipulated. A few men rule the nation. The masses move like sheep and do as they are told. Can you imagine 100 million people going to war of their own free choice? They are always led into war, or driven into it by a few ambitious or misguided politicians. Of course, when one nation goes to war, the attacked must defend themselves. And that is the only time when a war is fully justified. But what starts the aggressor? The 5 passions: ignorance, misunderstanding, on the part of the leaders. The real people, the hoi polloi, are not governing themselves. A government of the people, for the people, by the people has never existed, except in the noble heart of a Lincoln, or some such friend of man. What we really have is an oligarchy of the men of influence. And that generally means men of money. We know that is so. Hence the ideal government, as herein suggested, would mean nothing more than the substitution of a noble oligarchy in the place of an ignoble one. But even that is not the ideal. It may be added here, as a matter of fact, that the real government is an absolute monarchy. But the difficulty about that is that in order to secure such an ideal monarchy, it would first be necessary to find an ideal monarch. There is the rub. There is but one class of men on earth who can qualify for that position, and they will not accept it, the great masters. Their work is of a different sort. The next best plan is a spiritualized, scientific oligarchy. That oligarchy will lay all the emphasis upon the spirit. Let us make a significant suggestion. Suppose a whole nation is inhabited by the great masters alone. What would be their form of government? Shall we venture a guess? No government at all. And that is, after all, the ideal social body. But such an ideal can never be established, until all men become ideal in character. All that such a body would need would be keepers of records and centers of exchange and directors of channels of communication. The expense of such a nation would be but a millionth part of what the poorest nation now spends for the poorest government. Of course, such a body of men is but a dream in this age of Kali Yuga. I shall never forget one day in the University of Chicago, when President McKinley was addressing a mass meeting of faculty and students. Professor John Dewey, then head of the Department of Philosophy, sat by this writer. He was keenly interested in every word spoken by McKinley. It was apparent, even to a tyro like myself, that here was a man alive with the fires of genius. McKinley made some remark about the educated young men of the country carrying the scientific spirit into all channels of social activity. Professor Dewey turned to me and said, "That will never be done until spirit shall vitalize the processes of science. Spirit is the soul of the universe." I do not know if his later teaching bore out the import of this remark. If in his Democracy in Education he fails to lay enough emphasis upon the point which he so eloquently declared that day, perhaps it was due to preoccupation with other and, to him, more immediately urgent matters. He had a profound interest in humanity, and it was his wish to contribute somewhat to the building of a better social order. His aim was to do this by means of rational, scientific education. It was natural that he should lay the emphasis upon scientific training and actual work. The culture of the spirit might be left to men, whose speciality, that was, the masters. It seems such a pity, however, that Dewey did not know a real master. He would have made a most illustrious disciple. So, when the day arrives that the work of the educators, the scientists, the philosophers, all converge and join with spiritual culture in a new and universal science of all sciences, that will herald the dawn of the new age, that will constitute the inauguration of the new social order. If Dewey fails to give much credit to the Bergsonian elan, it is perhaps because he does not feel the necessity of talking too much about irrelevant things. He was busy with other matters. If Dewey appears to be wholly Darwinian in his fundamental hypotheses, that does not mean that he has altogether forgotten the spirit. If he thought to establish the naturalist point of view in all fields of endeavor, it does not mean that he believes the universe to be a jumble of blind adjustments to environment. Dewey sums up his conclusions by saying, "The only way to see the situation steadily and see it whole is to keep in mind that the entire problem of all philosophy and endeavor is one of the development of science and its application to life. Moral philosophy returns to its first love, love of the wisdom that is nurse of all good." It may be added here, although Dewey did not have that in mind, that the wisdom that is nurse of all good is the wisdom of the great spiritual masters. Dewey may or may not have realized that in the realm of the spirit lies that wisdom which is the very mother of all good. When mankind learns to enthrone the spirit, and when it seeks enrichment of the spirit by the scientific method, then we shall enter upon the first actual renaissance of all history. Man is the highest form of creation on this planet, and he is only a sojourner here. Once his eyes are opened, he knows that this world is not his home, and that he is no more than a feeder of swine among strangers, while far away the light burns in his Father's palace. He knows that this world is only a dark outhouse in the magnificent palace grounds of his Father's kingdom. The Master tells us that above and beyond the confines of this terrestrial speck of dust lie innumerable worlds full of light and beauty. To explore those worlds at will and to possess them during this lifetime is only a portion of our heavenly birthright. But to most people that vast universe of finer worlds unlocked and impenetrable. To many it is but a fabric of poetical fancy. But it is not so in reality. It is locked indeed, but the Master holds the key, and he offers it to all who will qualify. By that key the entire universe of starry worlds may be unlocked, and their shining heavens explored. Just how this is to be done constitutes the sublimest secret of the Eastern wisdom.